And I've just started the recording. We're going to let our attendees come into the room here, give them a moment. Great. Everybody, welcome to the 9th meeting of the Infrastructure Rebuilding and Resilience Commission. We're going to get right started today, and I'm going to hand it over to Linda to welcome us. Linda, go ahead.
Thank you, Brian. Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the 9th meeting of the Infrastructure Rebuilding and Resilience Commission. It was a year ago now that the December rainstorm and the flooding that devastated communities across the state and today motivates this commission to find ways to reduce harm from future storms. And I don't know about where you live, but where I live, we have been having what we're now calling the December storms. They haven't been as devastating, but they're blowing from the south, and the winds are ferocious, and they're blowing the ocean onshore in a way that hits our protected harbors in ways that they never did previously. And they're warm because they're coming from the south, so there's a lot of rain. So this is not something that's stopping. The interim report and recommendations that we provided to the governor just last month, they identified 12 broad strategies for improving the resilience of infrastructure and our communities in Maine. Over the next 5 months, we're going to lean into your areas of expertise to deepen our analysis and recommendations. And in May, we'll issue our final report. As instructed by the executive order, this will be a plan for Maine's infrastructure that increases resilience and speeds rebuilding through strategies that improve state and local planning, permitting, infrastructure design and engineering, finance mechanisms, workforce capacity, and related needs. That's a long and hefty list, and we've been making good progress on it. Today, in fact, we're going to present a work plan for the coming months, and I really look forward to your feedback and ideas in our discussion about it. We've got a couple of other things teed up first, and I'm going to hand it over to Dan to take us through today's program. Dan.
Thank you, Linda. So it's good to see everybody again. We are in the second phase of our mission, and the mission is now, I think, transitioning from information gathering to thinking about implementation and delivery. So today we begin with an update from Hannah Pingree on the work of the Maine Climate Council, which released an updated climate action plan for the state just a week after our interim report was released. Then we'll hear from Sam Brody about his team's analysis of federal funding opportunities for infrastructure and resilience, and a bit of an outlook for the years ahead. This will tee us all up for a discussion of federal funding programs, which Maine might prioritize, and what resources the state will need to compete successfully for these funds. We'll then shift our focus to state funding and an update from the agencies on the deployment of the $60 million in storm relief funding. After the updates, the Commission will discuss what lessons to draw from these programs and how they should influence our May report. After a break, we'll introduce, as Linda mentioned, a draft work plan for now through May, and we'll welcome your thoughts and inputs for the months ahead. I'd now like to hand it over to Hannah to start the afternoon session.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Dan and Linda, for kicking it off. And yes, we are, as Linda said, now one day beyond sort of the anniversary of the December storms and coming up on the January anniversaries. And I just kind of, before I get into the Climate Council plan, I do just want to reflect on the fact that the governor, this is our first meeting, I believe, since we released our interim report. I think both Dan and Linda delivered that report to her. I think she's taking the recommendations very seriously and thinking about how she and the administration, many of whom are represented on this commission, I can see their faces, are thinking about our roles in implementing, I think, a lot of the important ideas put forward in the interim report. So just again, I want to sort of thank everybody here and know, like a lot of the work and like the climate plan that I'm about to talk about, the governor takes seriously that we don't make plans just to make plans. We make plans to implement them. And I think she takes that responsibility seriously. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the updated state climate action plan. As Dan Tishman said, we released it just a week after the interim report. The governor went with us and many members of the Maine Climate Council to Bath High School, where we talked. I would say a lot of her speech was about the importance of resilience, just what we had seen and felt from the storms over the course of the last couple of years, especially the last year, and the urgency she feels to both take action on climate and better prepare our state for the kinds of challenges that we are certainly now feeling. So I'm going to be pretty brief. My co-chair, Commissioner Loism, is, I think as many people know, spending a lot of today in a Board of Environmental Protection hearing and hearing lots of, I'm sure, comments right now on rules that are also related to permitting and resilience. So just lots of overlaps in the work that we're all doing. So I'm going to speak just quickly about some of the recommendations that were made by the Maine Climate Council. We've talked a couple times about what the council was considering. So I want to share with you what they have finally proposed, specifically with things that overlap with this commission. But I do want to point out that I'm going to be speaking to the recommendations, especially that were made by Judy East and Ann Fuchs, who co-chaired the Resilience Working Group. I also see Joyce Taylor, who co-chaired the Transportation Working Group. There are relevant recommendations to their work, as well as Kurt Brown, who helped to lead the Coastal and Marine Working Group. So I think it's a good use of our time to understand the overlaps and the fact that there are lots of places where state government is trying to elevate the importance of this work and figure out how to get the work done. So next slide, Brian. Just a brief reminder, Maine has a climate law that requires us to reduce our emissions at least 45% by 2030 and 80% by 2050. It requires the state to be carbon neutral by 2045. And it also requires a plan every 4 years that helps to achieve those goals, as well as ensuring that Maine people, industries, and communities are resilient to the impacts of climate change. So the first state climate action plan under this new law, proposed and enacted under Governor Mills' time in office, was delivered December 1 of 2020, and our most recent updated plan was delivered again, as we've talked about just a couple of weeks ago, in time for the December 1 deadline. So every 4 years, a new plan is required. Next slide. So the sort of major 4 buckets that we put the categories and the actions of the plan in are reduce Maine's greenhouse gas emissions. Again, this is a statutory goal. We are required by law to reduce our emissions. Make Maine more resilient to the impacts of climate change. And obviously that is very aligned with the work of this commission. It's a harder one to measure. And actually, Brian and Brett, who also staffed the work of the Resilience Working Group, we spent a lot of time grappling with how do we measure that, but it is a major portion of our climate action plan. Encourage economic opportunity and prosperity through our climate goals, as well as advance equity through Maine's climate response. So the goals of the climate plan kind of break down into, next slide, into now 7 actions. The first 3 are primarily about emission reductions in transportation, buildings, and clean energy. But I will say that this climate action plan, as encouraged by the governor, every strategy has resilience components. And from our transportation infrastructure to our homes and buildings, to our clean energy, there was a lot more consideration of the concerns for resilience, for storm impacts, for tipped over oil barrels and basements and building codes as related to both resilience and emissions reductions. Creating and growing jobs through climate action. I think it's an obvious one. There's lots of activity happening in the state, but also I think, as this commission knows, a significant workforce need that is being driven by the kinds of infrastructure work that we need to make our communities more resilient. The next 3 strategies start to get more into really the full resilience strategies, protecting the environment and natural and working lands and waters in Maine, building healthy and resilient communities, and engaging with Maine people on climate action. So those are where the primary number of the resilience strategies live. So I'm just going to quickly highlight a few of the strategies that are very overlapping, and we didn't include everything but the main ones. Next slide. And I would love for Judy and Joyce and others, if you have any additions. I'm not going to read all the words on here, but I will say the Climate Council also very focused on increasing local capacity for climate resilience. We set a new goal that by 2030, we would like 80% of Maine's communities to be enrolled in the Community Resilience Partnership. I think we are now at about 200, Brian, correct me if I'm wrong, over 200 communities, or some number over 200 communities. 80% would be something like 380 towns. So we are making good progress. We're over 50% of the way there, but we think that this program that provides grants and technical assistance to communities for locally prioritized climate action, whether it's emissions reduction or resilience planning, has been a good way to start our relationship with towns. Providing incentives, grants, technical support has made a big difference. The council also, with Ann Fuchs and others' encouragement, has a strategy around community strengthening communication networks before, during, and after disasters. Sound very familiar to many on this commission. And continuing to develop tools to help communities think about how they manage the kinds of flooding, sea level rise changes that they are going to see, that obviously offer incredible decisions for homeowners and planning. Also, specific recommendation around local and regional capacity for the management of storm debris and household hazard waste, really an issue that after the December and January storms was something lots of municipalities were coming to all of us to talk about. Improving Maine's preparation and recovery for and from natural disasters, a major area of focus for both disaster planning and management, as well as a framework for measuring the effectiveness of the strategies that we're implementing. Expanding access and funding for climate adaptation. I won't go on. I know this is a major area of focus for this commission as well, but there was a lot of talk in the Maine Climate Council about not just public resources, which will need to be significant and available, but other types of finance tools that the state will need to help fund the kinds of infrastructure challenges that we are currently facing and will face in the future. Next slide. So just a couple more strategies, again, that will sound very resonant with this group. Helping Maine people prepare their homes, schools, and businesses for climate changes, from building codes and energy standards to other ways to help homeowners, especially low-income families, deal with the kinds of flooding and other risks, whether it is heat or water, that is impacting people's primary asset, their homes. Increasing funding, financing, and outreach for clean energy and storage options that make people's homes and communities more resilient. Identifying, funding, and expanding programs that help prevent spills from residential oil tanks, something that really came up for DEP staff and for lots of communities after last year's storms. And again, last but not least, major area of focus for this commission, Kurt is on the call, I know, protecting critical working waterfront infrastructure. So this whole strategy, I think, is very resonant with the actions that the state has taken following the January storms, as well as the discussions that this commission is having. So I think many people will say to themselves, well, the Climate Council, you're talking about all the same things. You know, what's the point of what you're doing? What's the point of what this commission is doing? I will just say that I think, as the governor envisioned it, as our office, which helps to support both processes, feels the urgency of implementing resilience recommendations requires a group of experts in both state operations as well as the private sector to think about how do we go deeper? How do we ensure that these recommendations happen on an accelerated timeframe. So that is sort of, I would say, why there's a lot of overlap, but also why this commission is now, I think, going deeper into many of the strategies that the Climate Council laid out sort of in broad form. So we are excited that this plan is now done. That means we can get back to really making the elements of it a reality. I didn't speak to some of the recommendations. I see Dr. Vaugh out there. The Climate Council's plan also really spoke to thinking about mental health impacts of storms and climate-related challenges. Clearly, we're hearing and feeling a lot of public health impacts from climate changes. That's kind of in the resilience realm. But we brought to you the recommendations that were, I think, most directly overlapping. So I will stop. I don't know if Anne, Joyce, Kurt, Dr. Vaugh, lots of you involved in the Climate Council, but specifically on these resilience realms, have anything else you want to add, but just wanted to make sure you are understanding that that there's a lot of focus on this for the governor and for the state. Kurt gave me a thumbs up and he's driving. So I'm just going to ask him to keep it on the road. And I won't tell this whole group. Kurt presented the recommendations of the Coastal and Marine Working Group back in June. He put out a very big number about the dollar amount that we think is needed to help rebuild Maine's working waterfronts long-term and make them more resilient. That made all the other working groups say, well, we needed a big number too. But Kurt and the DMR team did a really fantastic job on those recommendations. Anything else, Judy, Ann?
Nothing further for me, Hannah. Thank you.
Great. Any questions?
I just want to note that it feels really important to me to lean into the synergies between the two plans. And I know that's your message here, Hannah, and I just want to encourage my fellow commissioners to really think about where those overlaps are and where our work now for the next 6 months can really deepen the recommendations so we get extra bang for the buck from this, as opposed to just having two parallel plans, right? What we want to have is additional impact.
Absolutely, Linda. And I would say, I think one way, the Climate Council is a continuing required body in statute. And so it will kind of, I think, continue the work and thinking about implementation for the long term. A new plan is required every 4 years. We look at the science, we look at the impacts, and then we think about how we both tackle resilience and emission reduction strategies every 4 years. And then we meet quarterly to see how we're doing. This commission is kind of the intense work group to get into the weeds and details and make sure that we are, we have an implementation plan on the resilience side that is actionable in the next year. So we're the short term, go deep, and push hard to make it happen. Climate Council is a long-term body to continue to monitor and update plans, and again, has a statutory responsibility for making sure we're making progress.
Hey, Hannah.
Yes,
I'll
Judy.
just offer just one thing. Maggie and I think maybe Sarah and I are doing a final, what they're calling, they being the U.S. Climate Alliance, red flag review of climate and land use planning policy guide from all of the states. And I'm about halfway through. We've got to get our comments in tomorrow. But what I'm finding is it's called a policy guide. There's also some really great implementation recommendations in there from other states. So that should come out final in January with a lot of webinars through the winter. So I think that's going to provide some good scope for this committee as we go forward to implementation. Maggie, did you want to add to that?
Nothing to add, just definitely agree that there is a lot of good content there that could help.
Yeah, I would echo the comment I think made by both Linda and Hannah around, you know, these are very complementary commissions, and the work, the ultimate work product, we should be guided by, we don't want a lot of sort of unnecessary overlap, and we want to figure out where the gaps might be that should be filled. Ultimately, when you kind of brush away all the content, what the public will want to see, they'll want to see results, but they'll also want to understand what it's going to cost. And, we do know there's a cost to most of this stuff, and we don't want it to look like we have two efforts that aren't being coordinated.
Absolutely, Dan. And that is part of the hope, to keep everybody working on the same train. But I think we're now the focus. Climate Council has finished its work, sort of the heavy lifting, and now we go to more details. I will just say, I think Brian is going to reach out to all of you to see if you want us to send you a copy of the interim report of our commission, and we will also send you a climate plan. So you can spend your holidays just getting deep into all of the excellent words that we've generated. So,
Well, thank you. We look forward to it. Maybe somebody will put one of the reports to a holiday jingle.
Brian is talented, but we'll see. We'll see. That's a great challenge.
Yeah.
You don't want that.
Okay. Got that, Brian? Good. Well, we're running a little ahead of schedule. Are there any more questions on the Climate Council work or report? If not, we can move to Sam Brody's presentation. So you all know Sam, you've met him. In addition to providing content for our interim report, Sam and his team spent the fall on doing two different analyses. At next month's meeting, Sam will share some of the risk data analysis his team is working on for Maine, which will help us sort of prioritize, I think, some of the projects, especially in the near term, that we need to focus on. Today, Sam's going to share the results of a federal funding analysis to help us understand what funding is available that Maine should be making better use of. And we had a conversation earlier this week that, it is possible that sort of funding streams, given the change in administration, are going to dramatically change. Although one would hope not, because these issues certainly impact, all Americans, not just the state of Maine. And that there may even be some opportunities that are still available for issues that we've already experienced, as opposed to just be prospective funding. So after the presentation, we'll have about 25 minutes for discussion, in which we'll aim to narrow down the universe of federal programs into a handful that Maine should really focus on. I will just say as a sideline that we really are obligated, I think, to as our final product in the May report, to really focus on what this all means for the state of Maine, and a big part of that is what the cost of doing some of the things we are proposing, and that those should also come with just not the sources, but the timeline. So, some of the stuff we're going to do is going to be a very long dated horizon, or that we're going to recommend, and others is going to be really just immediate response to existing issues. So I think there's going to be a whole laundry list of things that we need to think of as opportunities to pay for what our commission is going to recommend. Obviously, we're not going to be able to recommend something that we have an absolute clear line of sight on all items to figure out how it's going to be funded. So I think I'll turn it over to Sam.
Thank you, Dan. Appreciate those comments. Wes, can you load up you're going to drive the presentation today. So we're going to briefly present the results of our comprehensive, extensive study on federal disaster funding, and hopefully have that tee up a discussion afterwards. Next slide. Next slide. So I think there's 3 reasons we wanted to do this. First, understand what's possible. Of the many opportunities the federal government provides and will probably still provide going forward. Federal funding is still the primary source of how states and localities can address disaster and flooding issues. So it's important, A, to know what's possible. B, how is Maine engaging in these possibilities? What's happened so far? And then see where are the opportunities to do better, to capture more federal resources. And as Dan noted, implementation of your plan is critical, and the funding part of implementation is a big part of that. So today's discussion can not just be about, hey, how do we get more money, but how do we implement effectively the plans and policies that we put in place. Next slide. So the first thing to know is that it is the most confusing, siloed, complex system of federal funding for these different issues. Multiple agencies have resources, programs, all with their different requirements. Generally, 6 agencies give out 80% of disaster preparedness, mitigation, and recovery funds. But the more I dig, the more we find. So we put together this document, and I hope that it gets into your hands, because we're just going to touch the surface. I cannot find anything as comprehensive and certainly as tailored to Maine. Thanks to Wes's good work, Wes Highfield, we're able to really show how Maine has benefited, and that's kind of where the gaps are moving forward. Next slide. So this is what 2017 disaster assistance looked like. It was about $120-30 billion. That was also the year Hurricane Harvey hit Texas. And you can see across the different agencies we're about to talk about, there's different allocations. Some are competitive, some are set aside, some do both at the same time. It is really confusing to come up with a roadmap. And so we hope that our products I see some laughs and smiles out there. We hope that, what we present today and the document, the technical document, provides a good roadmap and future discussion. So what I'm going to do is turn it over to Dr. Highfield, who is, in my mind, the world's expert on federal resource and funding and the data analysis. He's going to take you through enough detail, hopefully, that you'll say, hey, I want more, and pick up the document. But we don't have tons of time today. And then I'm going to come back and just give some thoughts on where we think Maine can do better, garner more resources, and after hanging out in Washington, D.C., some thoughts on what the future funding landscape looks like at the federal level. Dr. Highfield, take it away.
Thank you, Sam, for the kind introduction. I might bicker a little bit with the label of world expert. There are people on this commission right now who are incredibly knowledgeable about these areas. So I am going to hit the high points, but I also recognize that there are people here today that know quite a bit about this topic. As Sam mentioned, we're kind of looking at 6 buckets here of different funding opportunities. By and large, the first two buckets are the most important, coming out of DHS/FEMA as well as HUD. Coming out of DHS, you have the disaster relief fund, which gets split into, of course, lots of different buckets after that, followed by HUD, Housing and Urban Development. They run both community development block grants in the form of DR and MIT. Army Corps always has a role, right? They like to build things. And so we won't spend too much time on that today, but know that that is a construction approach to both mitigation and recovery. We'll spend a little bit of time today on USDA. I tend to focus quite a bit on residential and kind of the built-up urban environment, but it's real easy to slip past the agricultural side, and there are lots of opportunities there. Smaller bucket here is Department of Education. Of course, they are focused on educational facilities, but that's something to keep in mind as well. And finally, Small Business Administration. These are all going to be low interest loans, but they will support both small businesses as well as residential communities. So there's a couple of ways to kind of split this up at a high level. And the first of that is to kind of look at support and recovery programs. We would bucket National Flood Insurance Program, individual assistance, and public assistance into those buckets. The second way to look at this is through, kind of really a proactive mitigation approach, which is important. These are going to be things like Hazard Mitigation Grant Program, pre-disaster mitigation, FMA, Flood Mitigation Assistance, the newest program, which is FMA Swift Current, and of course, the BRIC program, Building Resilient Infrastructure in Communities. You'll also note some asterisks here. A lot of these aren't available at any time. You're going to have to, there's going to be a requirement for a presidential disaster declaration, and that's what opens up the doors to a lot of these funding sources. Just to kind of give you I'm going to tell a bit of a story with data as we go. These are annual NFIP claims in Maine, 1978 to 2024. They are apples to apples, so we're looking at everything in 2023 US dollars. And like all disaster data, there's rarely a signal in the noise, and this one's not much different. Lots of ups and downs here. Looking at this spatially, this probably doesn't surprise anybody in this room. So this virtual room as it is. I mean, the more people you have in one place, the more damage you're going to have in terms of flood insurance, and also where flood insurance penetration is the highest. And we'll get into that during the next session, but I just kind of wanted to paint a picture of what things look like over time and on the aggregate anyway for the state of Maine. When we start looking into individual assistance and public assistance funds, now these both require presidential disaster declarations. I have removed anything quote unquote biological from this, so we're not looking at COVID numbers. These are all meteorological events. Over the course of all the data I could find, and a small caveat here, this all comes from FEMA. So there's a possibility that the state of Maine has something that's a little bit more accurate, but up from a broad perspective, this should be roughly correct. $16 million in IA funds over the course of record keeping, and PA funds, 185 million. Again, 2023 US dollars over the course of record keeping, which aren't numbers to sniff at. IA funds, the thresholds here are a little different. It's not a quick, all right, there was a disaster declaration, now you get IA funds. So IA would be things like other needs assistance, small amounts, relatively anyway, small amounts of money to individual homeowners to kind of get back on their feet. But those thresholds are a little odd to work with sometimes. Public assistance, despite the name, which can be confusing, is geared toward infrastructure. So roads, bridges, etc. And that's why those numbers tend to be quite a bit higher, because they're more expensive to fix. Just kind of another graphic, because we all, at least I'm not a big fan of tables. This is what these public assistance, that's the yellow bars, project amounts, and IHP, another term for IA, in terms of FEMA, look like over time. Another bucket here is HUD. I talked about this very briefly, community development block grants for disaster recovery. The buckets for mitigation are quite a bit newer. But 4 HUD allocations in the realm of DR over the course of its history. 97, 98, 2 in 98, and somehow Hurricane Ike and Midwest floods in 2008. These are not competitive. These are legislative allocations, federal. Okay, so there's not an application for this. This is, as I put it yesterday, just pretty much straight lobbying at the federal level. These are not adjusted numbers, I should add. So over time, 24 million to Maine. If you look at the rest of the nation, we're at almost $100 billion. So likely some gaps there. There's been an increasing emphasis on moving away. So when we talk about IA and PA and NFIP, those are really a recovery-based approach to meteorological storms, right? Flooding, hurricanes, etc. It gets people back on their feet. It's a sense of recovery. Usually does not fill the gaps. And so there's been this increasing emphasis on shifting toward a more proactive approach, i.e. mitigation, right? BRIC is a perfect example of that. $1 billion put into BRIC so far. And different buckets too. Again, nothing is simple. So some of these are set asides that are not competitive, but the competitive portions of these BRIC funds are exorbitant amounts of money. If we go into this mitigation bucket for Maine, again, proactive, if you will, we're looking at 4 categories here. One of them is BRIC, and this is only the competitive side of BRIC. This is not the state set-asides. Brian can correct me if I'm wrong, but I think they're on the order of $2 million a year, or up to $2 million a year. So the BRIC we're looking at here is only the competitive side. Flood mitigation assistance, again, requires no presidential declaration, and it's a fairly small chunk of this larger picture. The 2 places that we do see Maine is doing great is a hazard mitigation program that does require a disaster declaration. But really, I think covering the bases there. And finally, pre-disaster mitigation, which again, no declaration required. And those see some fairly good numbers as well. So total 2023 US dollars over time, 99 to current, looking at about a little less than $77 million. Other funding sources. So unfortunately, you're stuck with text now, because I cannot find any good records on how these numbers have been allocated to the state of Maine, or really even the nation, at a more granular level. So something to think about though is a host of programs through USDA. Most of them through Farm Service Agency. So livestock forage, livestock indemnity, so kind of an uninsured livestock approach there. Sam likes to joke about the honeybees, but honeybees and fish tend to be a pretty good bucket to go into if you qualify. There's also a tree assistance program for forestry applications. a wildfire hurricane indemnity, again, and uninsured loss coverage. Another non-insured crop disaster, so crops lost that weren't insured, as well as things that go to individuals, which is the threshold for this is pretty tight. But it's a SNAP program, like you would have supplemental nutrition, like you would have anywhere else, but one specifically for following disasters, and that threshold's pretty high. Two more kind of oddities in terms of additional funding sources. Again, there's the Department of Education. So funds that go to rebuild schools is really all that amounts to. Schools, universities, etc. And finally, Small Business Administration. They will frequently, again, requires a declaration, but you don't have to have flood insurance necessarily. And it can be in addition to FEMA individual assistance if that threshold is met. Again, not grants, they're loans, but they're really low interest loans. And they're really intended to kind of fill the gap. Whether they do or not is another question, but fill the gap between FEMA IA and any insurance coverage that may slip through. Samuel?
Thank you, Wesley. So I'm going to just briefly address some recommendations that we see from our analysis for how Maine can move forward and provide some opinions on the future funding landscape from the federal level, which is very hard to, I cannot predict the future, unfortunately. But the one thing that I can for sure tell you is that federal assistance, both pre and post disaster, is going to favor states and localities with capacity. There's studies rolling out, everyone's up in arms. Why is all the BRIC funds going to already enabled states and communities? Because they have the capacity and the acumen in place to pursue those very complex but very lucrative projects. This slide just shows Wes highlighted of your 12 recommendations, ones that directly will lead to more capacity. And so for me, it's an opportunity. Okay, Maine wants to build capacity. How then do we understand the funding landscape to help us implement that? Next slide. There's a lot of, in my mind, low-hanging fruit, right? You've heard me say, first thing to do, go get an enhanced state hazard mitigation plan. We did it for Texas and we got all this credit for it, but it wasn't that big of a deal. It's some more tables and analysis and some monitoring. It's a 10% increase in federal assistance after a disaster. As Wes noted, some parts of the mitigation funds, Maine's doing great, but the opportunity still lies in BRIC, FMA funding. I'm talking competitive BRIC, and that with capacity, you'll be more competitive. Last year there was $2 billion in BRIC. That's going to decrease significantly, but there's still going to be hundreds of millions or up to $1 billion in that fund. And in my mind, it's for the taking. It's competitive, and FEMA is struggling because it's all going to the usual characters. The other insights that I can offer is really working with congressional delegations. A lot of these when we look at programs that were set up in other parts of the country, they came out of not competitive funding or set aside, but as Wes says, lobbying, educating. I can't lobby, Wes. You're gonna get me fired. Educating congressional delegations on the importance of this, because they see opportunities in the weirdest times and places to stick in millions of dollars. Texas and Florida are really good at that. Texas A&M, surprisingly to me, is really good at that. And I think it's made a difference in how those states are able to receive funding. And there's no magic sauce in it. But Angus needs to sit down and a talking to look for these opportunities, even if it's not directly related to disasters. There's opportunities to support disaster resiliency related work in different states. Wes and I highlighted 6 buckets. There are other buckets out there. NOAA, as you guys well know, because you're about to talk about the grant. EPA, USDA has some watershed programs, one of which had about $400 million in it a couple years ago, for states to do watershed planning around flooding. Having someone constantly keeping an eye on, it's a shifting landscape, I think is really a good way to proceed, both in terms of planning and also reacting to new stuff that's going to happen, because who knows what's going to happen. From what I can tell, there is a decreasing appetite for the federal government to pay out large sums after a disaster for recovery, and an increasing appetite, somewhat to my surprise, moving forward, on putting funds to not rebuild, recover, but stop the impact in the first place. So that BRIC, FMA, and other mitigation strategies are going to stand up, I think. There's going to be more emphasis in that area on how we build and where we build, both before and after a disaster. And that's going to be decoupled from climate specific resiliency. So I think trying to read between the lines, the built environment is central to understanding how we are resilient and reduce risk. And focusing clearly it's also tied to climate, but climate is going to be, as expected, downplayed in the next 4 years. But building, development, and economic recovery is going to be lifted up. What else do I have to say? But who knows, right? There's my mentors always say, just act normal, because you'll never predict what's going to happen. And it's every 4 years, new stuff happens. But I think there's something to be said by some of the feelers that I put out. And I don't tend to put them out as much as people just like to send me information. And so realize that my comments are an individual sample experience of one person. I get a lot of questions around insurance, and my feeling is the FEMA NFIP has been broken since I was born. They've been talking about the same issues for 50 years. Seems like it's still broken. Rates are going to increase potentially, continue to increase, but there's going to be a greater emphasis on private insurance, and the big ones right now, Puerto Rico is the biggest market, Florida is growing, but there's no appetite for huge changes moving forward. There was $100 billion disaster request in the federal budget bill. And yesterday, I was informed where that money is going to go. And then last night it all went, it all collapsed, and it's all uncertain. I don't think it was because of the disaster relief, But just to give you an idea, and who knows what's going, I don't think people are looking to gut the $100 billion for disasters, the other stuff. But last night, at least, $29 billion was going to go into the FEMA Disaster Relief Fund. $21 billion was going to farmers, to agriculture. And that surprised me because it to me, that seems like there was more interest in agricultural support, and that's an opportunity, knowing this, Maine can think through that, ag and forestry. Another $10 billion in economic assistance for farmers was put in there, and that probably would be taken out. It was non-disaster specific. $12 billion was going to HUD. And that's another, HUD is the Texas delegation got HUD money after Harvey, and that helped stand up a ton of programs. That was more political than it was a competitive application. Finally, 2.2 billion was set aside for SBA. Again, I was like, this is what's going to happen. And I woke up this morning and I read the headlines and like, the budget's dead. But something will happen. So I think that's enough said. And I think that some of my provocative comments may lead to more discussion, which is good. But I would use the document and the supporting materials as a way to come up with an implementation plan. And the last thing I want to say is that our 8 recommendations that we provided the commission chairs, which each had extensive write-ups, the last section in every one of those write-ups talks about funding opportunities. So there's some stuff that we didn't talk about today that's highlighted in those write-ups. There are examples of how other states have done it. Look at that as well in your holiday free time, because there's a lot there that we'll never have time to discuss, and again points to more direction to how Maine can increase its share of federal resources. Thank you.
Hey, Sam, thanks a lot. We have time here for a dialogue. And I think this is a really important topic to start dialoguing around. And perhaps this also becomes an agenda item for each one of our meetings going forward to, as we move into the work product. I think everything we talk about, whether it's working waterfront, whether it's permitting, whether it's resilient, whether it's capacity, has to tag, okay, let's brainstorm around each one of these. What are the, what are the funding opportunities? I actually have a whole bunch of questions. I'm going to throw them all out, and then Sam, you can, or you or your team can just decide which ones we could answer now and which ones we should, or talk about now and which ones we should, hold for the future. But, I in no particular order at all, it seems to me, I'd love to hear, one of the things you talked about is there's this universe of opportunity, funding opportunity. But then there's a deployment mechanism. And, you first have to be able to secure the opportunity, right? And Maine has secured some opportunity. I have no idea to know whether those numbers are good numbers or not good numbers, because they're just numbers. Over the years, we've gotten 24 million or whatever, that sounds like a big number, but if there was a $50 million opportunity, it's kind of like half of what you could have gotten. So the thing that's less or just as opaque for me that I think we really need to look at is, and it's almost like doing a pro forma, okay, you know, we have opportunity mostly at the federal level. What is the capacity we need to kind of achieve 100% or something close to 100% of uptake of that capacity? Because it doesn't all exist at the state level. And in fact, I believe probably a lot of it exists at the community level. And we already know that the community level doesn't have the capacity to do it. So unless we build that capacity, and I don't think right now we even know what that capacity looks like. And does, so it'd be interesting to know how other states, I mean, Texas, much bigger state, much bigger government, many larger municipalities that have budgets to apply. And my guess is that there's a disproportional weighting that those municipalities that have the infrastructure and capacity to really get out in front of the federal, they're the winners, and the small places that don't have that capacity, they're the losers. And in fact, probably those communities are the ones that need it the most, and a smaller number goes the furthest distance. So if that in fact is true in Maine, how do we fix that? So that's one big thing that I think we should think about relative to our, how we can capitalize. I really love the notion also. So that's number one. Secondly, I'd love the notion of, okay, there are federal funds that are available for recovery. And they immediately go in, and I in my commercial life, we have been one of the biggest contractors deploying FEMA money into rebuilding, and virtually none of that is, except maybe right after Sandy, very little of it was creating resilience. It was just building things back. Maybe they were built back a little better, but it was like, let's get it built back. These people need to go to work. Whatever. I love the notion of really looking at opportunities for sort of future. What can you do to implement? And I suspect there are, maybe, if you think about it that way, there may be other buckets that we aren't even really thinking about. And one that jumps out at me is the Federal Land and Water Conservation Fund, which, actually had the largest funding in the last Trump administration, almost $1 billion. And it's there to acquire sensitive and important land, and is deployed much more rurally than it is, in an urban standpoint. So, I wonder if there are ways we can think about as we move forward with sort of your risk assessment. And if we discover, for instance, and I'm making this up, if there are, if there are drainages, if there are landscape-wide drainages that are particularly vulnerable, do we start thinking at the state level to try to lock some of those up on a state basis through federal money, whether it's the LWCF or there are lots of other land conservation pools of money available, to build resiliency through that, and getting a list of all of the programs that are available. That's a much more proactive approach. And then just the last one, which is kind of a, has anybody really thought of, at the federal level, of policy, federal tax policy that might give an advantage for doing resilient work? So, in the commercial real estate world, you can depreciate things, and you can essentially take a tax benefit through depreciation. If you can demonstrate that you're utilizing, and that could also be done at the state level, but that you're utilizing perhaps the same sort of tax depreciation opportunities for resilient infrastructure. It would be on the private side, because the public side doesn't pay tax, kind of lobby for incentives that actually help private funds do the work, as opposed to always having to rely on federal funds. So I'll shut up there.
Yeah, a few responses, Dan, to the great questions and comments. One of the to me, one of the keys looking at other states and examples is how they creatively cobble together multiple sources, and coming up with a strategy to intentionally do that. What is the best recipe? So here you've got this recommendation, you want to implement it. There's not going to be one single source of funding to do it or go after. You know, what is the most efficient way to pursue it with capacity? And capacity, there are two things related to capacity. One is people. I like the idea of this, what I call it, technical assistance corps. So it's a kind of a centralized group of people that then go out and serve multiple communities. So you get boosted in that way. You get more coverage. And it wasn't, I ripped that idea off of Texas in some ways, where Texas hired 100 new county liaison officers, and they did it through what's it called? Hang on a sec. The Emergency Management Performance Grant program within FEMA, which leads to the second part of capacity, which is state resources, because that program and other programs require a match. And what we did not recommend in our write-ups, but the idea of having a fund for Texas, they literally call it the rainy day fund, and it's enormous. But they're very stingy with it. But, and we saw what Vermont has done. A matching fund, whether it's for buyouts of property, whether it's for, standing up something like Texas did, and being able to rely on those funds, I don't know how you do it financially, is kind of the other part of capacity we tend not to, and capacity building that we tend not to focus on. I think you're skipping your last comment. There's tremendous opportunity to start thinking about incentivizing private sector construction in a way that leads to more resiliency, because the federal system, as we all know, it's the system more than the builders and the people who want to live in these structures that drive us into doing the same thing, rebuild in the same way, in the same spot. And that's how you get funded. That's just not a recipe for long-term resiliency. I think the private sector has the greatest opportunity to really lead the way and innovate. And that I'm sure in the future administration, those ideas are going to be really well received. And there are other models out there in terms of how to incentivize companies and individuals that can be applied. So Wes and Basilia, any other add-ons to that?
No, I think you hit the high points quite well. The only thing that I would emphasize there is, I know in that last slide, there was a bullet about matching funds for buyouts. And that really needs to be matching funds for anything, because sometimes those matches can be tricky to come up with otherwise. And they can also be negotiated.
Really?
Yeah.
Kind of like indirect.
I see
And
Pete's got a question.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Yeah, Sam and Wes, I'm wondering what your folks' experience might be with some of the public-private partnership funding programs like NIFWF, the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. They have a number of resilience program funding that's quite competitive, is my understanding, that can fund an array of different things. And is that something that we should look into as well?
Absolutely. I'm involved in I'm on the board of the Houston Wilderness Organization. Sounds like a contradiction. And they get NIFWIF grants, and they are very successful. It's a very small organization. Who wouldn't be a proponent of wilderness in Houston? And yeah, it's another great, someone write that down on our side, that's another great opportunity, which may be even more, they couple that with foundation grants, right? These nonprofits are really savvy. They cobble all kinds of stuff together. The reporting is a burden for them, but they're a small organization. So NIFWIF, I think, is great. Shell Oil is involved in that. And for them, they'll get a NIFWIF grant, and then Shell will match it as part of the partnership. So that's another, and Maine coupling that with their foundational grants, I think that's a great comment.
Hannah?
Hannah?
Sure. Well, thank you for that. And I saw Joyce also put in the protect grants that DOT goes after for similar resilience projects, which we've gone after a lot. Joyce can speak to sometimes it goes well, sometimes it doesn't. Dan kind of got at this a little bit, but Sam, I'm interested in how thinking about sort of capacity, and we spent so much time in this commission talking about capacity. You've heard us, and honestly, like, we have Shiloh here from Maine. I mean, we have like local government capacity challenges in managing projects and managing, FEMA, after you have all kinds of very small community capacity challenges. And then we even have, at MEMA level, sort of capacity challenges of having enough staff to go after these funds. But when you talk about these states who really have a much higher level of planning and capacity to compete, I mean, can you just give us examples? And again, maybe this isn't some of the materials, but just sort of speak to some of the states, what they've developed, and how that is helping them to compete. I mean, Maine won't ever be Florida or Texas, just given our size and, bandwidth and state budget. But still, if you could give some sense of state, local, regional, what does that look like? And I know it's a little different from how we've talked about capacity here. So if you could speak to that, that'd be great.
And it's interesting because every state is always complaining they don't have enough money, no matter how much they do or how much capacity. Texas is again an interesting example because there is a lot of comparisons with Maine in terms of its rural nature. It's very strong local emphasis, local control, local government. Texas, in recognition of that, has made a bunch of moves in the last 10 years to create a cadre of technical experts in different ways that are centralized in different ways, but then go out into communities. One is these disaster agents, almost like a Sea Grant type. It's in the AgriLife Extension Service, which is part of A&M. They were able to get, I think they were funded through the Division of Emergency Management, which gets their money from the state, to assist local communities, live in local communities, and that's growing. And the reason why they're doing it is the same reason you're interested in capacity is these local communities get just as much rain and surge as Houston, Austin, and San Antonio. San Antonio doesn't get rain, but in my opinion, they don't have that capacity. So it's kind of bootstrapping and providing the resources and the awareness to let the local communities do it themselves, right? We're not going to go in and do it for you. These liaisons are there to work for the communities and help the communities become, remain autonomous. That's really important. And the second part is the CLOs, county liaison officers, the Division of Emergency Management, TEDM, wants to do the same thing. They wanted a county liaison officer for all 254 counties in Texas. See, it's only taken me 24 years to become Texan. And they use that FEMA grant with matching money to hire an additional 100 to complete the picture. But again, they're the locals run the show. We're here to work with the locals. And then in the Institute's experience, we got a $1 million appropriation to go out and work with these under-resourced communities in a technical way, providing data assistance, data gathering, everything from making, you heard me talk about it, paper maps to running flood models. And the appetite for that was so great. I said, we'll do 3. We did 10 communities. And I've been really vocal about how that's not just Texas, that's all over. There needs to be doing it the right way, which is, going to these communities and the communities telling the technical experts how they're going to help versus the consulting format where you go in and say, okay, this is your problem, this is what we're going to do for you, and scaling that up. And so Texas has been, I'm shocked that it's happening at that level in Texas. They have hundreds and hundreds of folks, and that's just specific to disasters and flooding. And then there are other agents, of course, Sea Grant and other ag agents out there. So I really like that model. And when I go to Maine and look at Maine's issues, it really resonates. Those kind of things really resonate. Every state is innovative and creative in cobbling together different sources. And I personally, I like to take the insane risks. I like to go for the low probability, high impact grants. It's almost like, I tell my students, most people, when they go to a shopping mall, they won't go to the best space because they know it's taken. They think it's taken. They go middle to back in the row to park. I always go to the best space because sometimes it's there. And I feel like that posture with Maine would help it, better apply for BRIC and be aggressive and go for the insanely competitive opportunities because they're going to be there, I think. And Maine has such a great story to tell, and such, I've said this before, from local to state, the problems and know what need to be done. And that's puts you head and shoulders above other states. You just need the resources, and then implementation will always be problematic. And it'll never be perfect, but you got to take one step at a time.
Great. Thank you, Sam. And I see Deborah has a question. I would only just comment, you mentioned Senator King. I do think it's interesting the opportunity you suggested with the delegation. We now have the incoming chair of the Appropriations Committee, Senator Collins. So I think we do, as a commission, those of us in the administration, think about the opportunities you shared and how we think about the upcoming Congress and both senators and the rest of the delegation. So I think that's helpful. So,
Deborah?
Thanks. Sam, in cobbling together these multiple funding sources, how often do they include philanthropy? And what's the role for philanthropy?
Great question. Wes, you want to take that? You want me to take it?
I can take it, but my answer is going to be pretty slim. I'm not aware of any.
that's another huge opportunity. And I'd almost connect you with the head of the Houston Wilderness Organization, who's gotten millions of dollars combining philanthropy and NIFWIF and other grants. She's just a super charismatic person who, bends people to her her vision. I think as a bridging mechanism, philanthropy can play a really important role. Whether it's filling the gaps, to me, it's more bringing together private, public sector funding opportunities. So less just filling the gap, more being a catalyst for collaborative funding situations. Because philanthropists and those types of individuals and organizations, they don't come with a set of rules and politics. They tend to be really good, bridging organizations and all of this. And I'd love to see more. And the institute, our institute, we're coming up with a plan to better engage with foundation and philanthropists in this space, as kind of the third leg of the stool that we have not even considered. So to you, the charge to you is to lead that space.
Right. So is it, used both the term bridging and catalyst? Is there a place in the catalyst kind of category for philanthropy to go first, or is that too risky? Like, in other areas like housing, philanthropy might be that early money, as you know. Is that unwise until you have a sense that there's other public money coming? I think there's plenty of interest. So just curious what you think about what's most effective.
I think there's both strategies can work in the right situation. Planting the seeds, right?
Yeah.
Seeding collaborations,
Yeah.
and following it up with bridging money is what I would want to do if I was a philanthropist. And seeding unique and creative and innovative stuff that wouldn't happen under normal, government or large foundational requests.
Right.
Well,
Okay.
Sam, can I ask, and I know Joyce has a question, but can I just ask a follow-up on that? One of the things that's interested me, and it's around philanthropy, and it has to do with how your center got set up, because it seems like your center has had to be funded by a number of things. I know you mentioned now it's being sort of funded by fees, but initially AMM, which is a state program, but still, departments I'm sure are to some degree funded philanthropically. One of the things I've been wondering that I think we will address in the next month is, does some of the capacity that we're talking about ultimately reside in a non-state agency or entity? Is it a new entity? Is it an offshoot of the University of Maine? Is it part of Bowdoin College? I don't know. I have no horse in that race, but to me, there may be a way to interest philanthropists in building capacity if it's associated already with a philanthropic institution, which may be connected to education, because this is a way for people to learn. And just, over time, it may be interesting to understand how you built your center, and how, if there are other places like this around. So for instance, I know the state of Colorado has a very active, world-renowned avalanche center. And, that's philanthropically supported. So I just throw that out there.
Yeah, and it sounds like in the coming months, we're going to talk more about this. And I have pledged to share my story. And part of the way we set up the Institute is we looked at other entities and institutes and how they did it. Every story is a little different, but we purposely, I looked at the world like a stock portfolio, right? You have to have diversity. And so we have federal funds, we have state funds, We have individuals who contribute philanthropically, and being, Basilia has reinforced the importance of being connected to a large research university, the benefits of doing that. But what Wes and I can tell you is being centered in A&M, doing what we do, we're constantly fighting with the bureaucracy. It has its own bureaucracy, and we're constantly, let's say, working with our funders because there are so many constraints on the different types of funds. NSF funds are different than state of Texas funds, which are different than NOAA funds. Philanthropic. So two takeaways. Definitely want to use the power of and the educational purpose of a university or college. I'm biased with Bowdoin, of course, because but somewhere, in this case in Maine, but have that entity be positioned in a way that it can remain an innovative, evidence-based, flexible entity that isn't subsumed into an archaic siloed university process. And I imagine Charlie has some stories to share there. The philanthropic injection of funds is the rainbow of support, in terms of happiness rainbow, joyful rainbow, because the flexibility of that funding and the innovation that can come from funding of that type frees us from the chains of federal and state government and university support. So we got a startup from the university that we've spent, but there are strings attached. So if I had to do this over again, I would start with a philanthropic entity or individual who wants to, would share and shape the vision of this entity, connect it to a university, both from a partnership standpoint, participating with other researchers, infusing that entity with students who are always the smartest, technological savvy element of society, and giving it the flexibility and the freedom to really go out and do these things that are somewhat unconventional. You don't think they would be, but the Institute for Disaster Resilient Texas really doesn't fit anywhere. Are we research? Yes. Are we practice? Yes. We're an innovation based organization, and our operations team is always getting feedback. Why do you do it this way? We don't do it this way. We do it a different way. Well, we can't do what we're doing if we did it that way. So just Wes and I have been for 20 years dealing with these issues. The pot of gold at the end of the rainbow is funding, support, and vision from philanthropical or sometimes foundation, sometimes they're the same, foundational actors. Wes, I know you could talk a lot about this, but am I on target here?
100%.
I think a lot about it.
There's a constant battle, and federal, at least for us, federal and state funds are far exceed that of philanthropic funds, but they allow a level of flexibility that is just so much. Yeah, but the other funds are soul crushing.
Sometimes it doesn't feel flexible on the other side, though.
I can appreciate
from the donor's perspective, working with a university can be very frustrating.
Oh, no doubt.
With the massive admin fees and things like, it's just another thing to feed. So it's, both sides are important.
Yeah, no, that's well said. But the connection to a university setting, or maybe multiple universities, I think is priceless.
You know, an interesting opportunity we have. I'm mindful of the time because we're running a little over. I will say the one thing that may be unique about Maine compared to Texas is that small population. There are already some fairly mature nonprofits that are not associated with the university that are research based. They happen to reside on the coast, and they are embedded in fairly wealthy communities. And I think there's a very rich opportunity, especially when you talk about a waterfront, which we have the longest in the United States, which has now become quite wealthy, with the exception of the very small piece of working waterfront. And to stand up a matured entity that could, at least as part of its mission, suggest how it preserves the value of the real estate on the waterfront. You know, there's always a hook. I think could be something that could be funded. I don't know that we're talking about a huge number of dollars. It's not the funds that's going to actually rebuild, because that's billions, but it could be the funds that strategize about the process and build the capacity. I'd like to get to Joyce, who has her hand up, and then I'd like to move on to Linda.
I just wanted to circle back to something that Sam said and make a point, and since Hannah brought up Senator Collins, but I think it's really important to be proactive and be ready for those opportunities when the delegation has an opportunity. I've personally been involved in a few weekend drills where a certain senator wanted to get Maine some money, and we cooked up this program over the weekend that Maine was the only one of 4 states that could apply for certain money. I mean, we weren't real popular with the other states, but we got some money. And I know here at DOT, we've gotten to the point that we have a list at all times so that when we get asked, we know that we can give the delegation something that they can support. We find the things that they will hone in on. You know, she's going to always like rule stuff. I mean, so I think she's in an incredible position, frankly, right now. And I think the other, you know, Senator King has been incredibly supportive, representative. So I would not sneeze. Maine's going to be in a really interesting position right now, and we should be taking advantage of that. But you have to be ready to give them stuff when they ask. You can't just think about it. I mean, it could be an hour or two. Sometimes we've had like literally an hour to come up with a project. So I would just say that, you know, we need to think about that and what we could ask for.
Dan, do you want to make any final comments?
No, I think other than this has been a great conversation, and I think there's lots more to discuss around this issue. I think we're going to talk about working groups going forward, and you know, we clearly should have a funding working group.
Joyce, thank you for your very proactive comments at the end there, concluding that part of the discussion. I'm grateful for those. I really heard Sam talking about that, and his analogy of the parking spot is, having been a New Yorker for long years, is a very apt one and one of my favorites. And I think what I heard Sam saying the most is that as a state, we could be a little bit more aggressive and a little more proactive, be willing to take a little bit more risk with asking for money, because the worst thing that's going to happen, as any of us who have raised money knows, is that people will say no. The best thing that happens is that they're going to say yes. So let's get the parking spot in front of the theater and not be driving around the block if we don't need to. So with that, because I can never get through a meeting without putting a theater analogy in, apparently, we have 2 big parts of this meeting left for the group. And the first part is going to be hearing from our state agency folks here, from 4 different people, about what the $60 million in storm relief programs, what's the status of those, and what we're really, the discussion we want to have is what should we as a commission be learning from the deployment of that funding? Because that will help inform us as we go toward both gathering additional funding and how we use those federal recovery funds. So we're going to have that conversation for about 40 minutes. And then as Dan has noted, the final part of our meeting, and maybe the most important in terms of implementation of the plan, will be to go over and agree on the work plan for the next 5 months. So everybody good? Ready to go? We are going to have Heather Johnson from the DECD, although is she here? Or do we have Jake? Are both Heather and Jake here? I see Jake.
It'll just be me.
Okay, Jake, thank you. So we've got Jake. We've got Pat Kelleher from the DMR, Joyce Taylor from DOT, and Brian from GoPIF to be talking about what projects and needs have been funded, where is there still unmet need in your assessments or from what you're hearing, people that didn't get funded, and what are the next steps? So let's begin with you, Jake.
Sure. I took you said my name first, so I just kind of assumed. So I'm already sharing my screen. So I'm the Small Business Development Manager at DECD, and I've been running the Business Recovery and Resilience Fund. We were given $10 million to put out. I'll give you guys some numbers and things to consider as you go forward. We had 220 applications come in for round one. You can see the breakdown by county on the side of who applied versus who was awarded. The damages indicated this is indicated by the applicants, so take it with a little bit of a grain of salt, but it does sort of track with what I was seeing. Was about $34 million. There were 5 business applications that came in over $1 million. One of them considerably over, like $1.5 million. So that average number is a little bit skewed. And they requested, after I adjusted down to the cap of $100,000 per applicant, $11 million. Of that, we funded 170 applications, and the payout has been $8 million. And just to give you guys some context, we had, of the 220 applicants, 49 of them were able to be funded just based on what they provided. So we turned this program around very quickly. I think a lot of these applicants might not have done grants before. And so there was a big lift to get in touch with the 171 other applicants to get additional information. Like 60 of those were kind of like provisionally approved and just needed to provide invoices. Maybe they had provided pictures and detailed accounts, but we're just missing that contractor invoice to kind of really solidify it, to give us confidence that we could make that award. But other ones were needing additional back and forth, and that's sort of what's taken the most amount of time to move things forward. In terms of what counties and everything, I'll just highlight that, I think it kind of makes sense that Cumberland, Hancock, Knox County, York County, all on the coast, all got hammered, and Kennebec being on their river. That all just makes sense. So where are we going to go from here? Again, we've put out $8 million. We've got about $2 million additional. We've kind of broken round 2 into 2 groups. It's open right now with applications being due in the middle of January. The first group is going to be those who were not funded in round 1. Those requirements will be incredibly similar to round 1. We didn't change anything really, other than we won't be doing this back and forth for months that we did this time. We're expecting more completed applications, and we're messaging that. So if you weren't funded, come on back to us. And then to ensure that we get out the remainder $2 million, anybody in round 1 who was funded, they can come back to us as long as they have an additional $10,000 grant request. So if they were up against the cap, but they could have received $2 million, that's an over-exaggeration, they could come back and say, hey, I'm requesting that I be considered for additional funding. But I think what's happened to a lot of people is that they applied, this was back in May and June, and then they started doing the work over the summer or getting an engineer or whatever they needed, and they realized, oh, this is not going to be the price that I expected. And so I think this gives anybody who was awarded a chance to come back and say, hey, scopes have changed. This is what we're really going to need. Based on the information I have from round one, those that were over $10,000 just on the receipts that they gave me versus what I could give them, there's an additional $7 million in need just there. So that I'm not concerned about putting out this additional $2 million. I think that comes to our choices as the department about what we were looking for. And we wanted to make sure that we cast a wide net with these funds. And so we capped it at 100,000. And so you can see that we had 12 applications so far for for the new people and 9 so far for the other. Takeaways that I want you guys to consider. It was all sectors, it was all industries, and it was all over the state, right? We worked with anybody from hotels, breweries, you name it, they reached out. I think a lot of them, again, this was their first grant. And I think that there would have been additional, like of the 50 applicants that we didn't fund, I would say the majority of them were apartments and short-term rentals, because the line that we drew in the sand was if it was residential, they were out, because you had to make a distinction between business and not. But plenty of short-term rentals, apartment complexes got hit hard and didn't have a place to go in this grant. The one thing that surprised me as I got through this is we had a question about, tell us your resilience plan. What are you going to do? And we provided a definition, tried to make it easy. And the number of applicants that said, we're going to literally paraphrase, try hard, we're going to just work more, rather than giving an actual plan, an actual, hey, I'm going to build this up 3 feet higher. Like that wasn't a consideration. So that is something that the Office of Business Development is definitely looking towards. How can we get educational resources out? How can we get people thinking not just about climate, but about operations for their business, not having just one provider of their raw material, in addition to having a generator so that way you can continue in bad weather. This last one is more just about state process for us. I think we've worked really hard to get the payments out, but we've gotten out 140 so far of the 170 total. It doesn't move at the speed of business. So part of it is a business gets the award letter and says, great, I'm going to be getting my check soon, not realizing, and we put in that it would take probably 6 weeks for them to get it. But businesses, after a couple of weeks, are starting to go, well, where is that? And I think that they sort of expect disaster helpful money to come out quickly, especially because this program got stood up and launched in May. Applications were due in June for storms that happened 6 months ahead of time. So even just waiting a couple of weeks was hard for them. And just because I want you guys to leave with a couple of feel-good notes, this stuff just came in the last week or so. I was talking to Ripple Effect, which is a nonprofit that operates on Cow Island in Casco Bay, youth organization. And they were from being worried that they were going to lose their campus on Cow Island, knowing that they were very susceptible and had all of this work to do with not a lot of money to do it. And the executive director called me and said, hey, this has been a game changer. Now, not only do we have a path forward, but a realistic one at that. And then I received tons of emails like this that just said something to the effect of, hey, I was about ready to give up and my business wouldn't have kept going if not for this. So kudos to all of us who got this going, I guess, or all of you. So that's sort of what I had to share with you all. Happy to take questions now or at the end of the other presentations.
Great, Jake. Thanks. I think that we'll do the other presentations and then take all the questions at the end. But I did have one question of clarification. I think it was on your first or second slide where it showed the total projected amount of damages versus the amount of funding that went out in round one. Was I reading that correctly, that only about 30% of the estimated amount of damages were funded?
So there were $34 million in damages indicated, but some
Yeah.
of that could have been paid for by insurance,
I
right? And
see.
so this is total damage number. So the
Okay.
requested amount, again, once I funneled it down to only 100,000, is how much they actually requested of the grant. And then once we filtered out the 50 applicants that did not get what they asked for, then I'm down to 8 million. And like some people, you might have asked for 70,000, but you only showed me invoices and receipts for 100,000, meaning your award would be 50,000. So there was a lot of back and forth, and I'm happy to clarify that more if need be.
Okay, great. Thank you. Let's move on to Pat Kelleher and the DMR, who had 20 million for working waterfront repairs and restoration. Pat.
Great. Thank you, Linda, and good afternoon, everybody. I think we actually had 25 million because we spent more than 20.
Thought so too.
We spent more than 20, so if we need some more money, Hannah's going to have to, search the bottom drawers over there. So, first of all, I never want to talk about this money without saying that this work couldn't have been done without the support of the Department of Transportation. DOT was just a tremendous partner here, and they're the ones that are actually getting the checks cut and out the door, and having them in their ability to enter into those agreements with the towns really allowed us to move this process along much more quickly than we would have through our other avenues. At this point in time, about 15% of the funds have been drawn down. Part of the reason that a large portion of the funds have not been distributed is that some of the projects did their minimum repairs to get the facilities up and running and operational for this season, and they'll be doing more significant work in the coming months. One of the other things that we had, or really DOT had to deal with, when we found this out kind of late, is some of the towns said, "Hey, we can't receive these funds and distribute these funds without having a town vote." So that slowed the process down a little bit. And in fact, last night Portland went through a city process to decide whether to enter into the agreements with DOT, and this is for 4 major projects that totaled 6.5 million. And the city council voted unanimously to support that, to help get the funds out on the street. So that was certainly critical. As I think you're all aware, working waterfront projects that we are funding are very diverse, very similar to the diversity that we see on our working waterfront. The awards that we gave out range from 4,000 up to 2 million. We have some very large projects that are already been completed, but many others are only partially completed or not yet begun. The reasons for some of those delays are just what we've talked about in the past at some of our other meetings. We have capacity issues as far as contractors and some of the professional engineering work, and there's certainly some things that we and GoPIF continue to talk about how we can resolve some of these, and I'll get to some of that in a minute. But projects overall are still, they're going to try to obtain their engineering work and figure out how they can proceed. If you all remember, this is a match grant, and so we have had some indications that a few of the successful applicants are having problems raising the funds on their side to cover the other side of these grants. So we'll continue to have discussions with them. I think time is a little bit on our side here. So we're hoping that we can use time to help assist them to see if there are ways to find other funds on the outside that they could use for matching this state money. Let's see. I think as far as one of the questions that was posed by GoPIF staff for me to talk about was really the unmet needs. And I think if you looked at the Climate Council report, and Hannah referenced it today, and has spoken to this, there is a tremendous amount of unmet needs on the coast as far as working waterfront. For this project, we focused where the most damage was for the storms. We were looking at the bigger projects those bigger projects that also impacted the most individual people who fish from those piers, from those wharfs. So in this case, everybody who applied actually, I think except one who just didn't meet the qualifications, received the preliminary award of the funds. So there's a lot more to do here as far as what the next steps are. DMR is continuing to work with GoPIF and our partners on what the next steps are. As a reminder, we have $10 million that Senator Collins was able to get appropriated through the commission, Atlantic State Marine Fisheries Commission, and back to DMR. Those funds are available. We have written our preliminary spend plan, which is very broad, to make sure the money was released. And then what we're doing now is working with GoPIF on making sure that the money that they receive through that larger NOAA grant, we can work together to put one funding round out. And I don't know if Hannah wants to talk about it, but I think we've had some really good, positive preliminary discussions amongst the agencies, and we'll be pulling together some meetings here after the first of the year to figure out, okay, what are we going to do? And I'll quote Hannah Pingree by saying the money that we have is precious, and it's precious because we're unsure of how much more money that we will be able to bring to the table from a federal perspective. So we want to make sure that we are able to utilize this money to benefit certainly a lot of the municipal structures along the coast, but also have a pot of money that would be available for smaller private wharfs, for instance, for design and engineering and permitting costs that are really slowing some individuals down and trying to figure out how to move forward. There was a lot of conversations in the previous agenda item about going to Washington. I just got back from Washington. We certainly have, and Hannah reiterated a minute ago, we certainly have a champion in Senator Collins as the new chair of appropriations. She has indicated her willingness to continue to try to help on the resiliency issues. And so I think as we think about what these changes are, and I'm reflecting back on a comment that Dan made as it relates to some of these federal funding, I think we really need a review of some of these other pots of money to figure out if there are any ways that we can add additional language as well for resiliency to make small towns, private wharfs, municipalities become eligible for funds that we certainly have not been able to access in the past. You know, who knows what's going to happen to a lot of these federal funds. The budget is up in the air right now, but I think we need to be, to use your words, Linda, aggressive in how we're going to think about moving forward for all of this. But certainly that's going to be my approach with working waterfront. So, and that's all I had. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Pat. Joyce for the DOT.
Hey, I'm going to share PowerPoint. Oh, can you guys see that? Yeah. Were you shaking your heads? Yes. Okay. So this is actually, we had $25 million of additional money for infrastructure adaptation, and we rolled out the program literally, I think, a month or so after the legislature voted for it. We didn't have access to the funds till I think September. So we've got out pretty quickly. This is actually a picture of Roque Bluffs. This is one of the hits that happened in January, and we awarded this project for design funds. So I just thought I would share that. So in all, we awarded $25 million, $25.2 million to 39 communities. There were a total of 43 projects. One of the decisions that we did make was to carve out $5 of that million for stream crossings, for culvert projects, realizing that a lot of the flooding was due to undersized culverts, and we wanted to spread the money around the state more. And if we had just, done it for water and treatment or wastewater or stormwater, those projects are so expensive. We probably would have only funded, 5 to 10. So there's a huge need in the state for more culvert money. I'll talk about that. But you can see we did have one up in Aroostook County. They pulled the funding because the culvert came in so high from the bid price that they just they decided to hold and wait. So this is an example of one of the culvert projects. This is Hampton. We did cap the culvert money at 200,000. This is one that has regularly flooded in the past. It's an aging culvert. It's really just a small corrugated culvert. They're actually going to put a 16-foot box culvert back in here. That's how undersized it is. When it floods, 9 residential homes are cut off. And this is really typical of the type of project that we are seeing. One of the things I would say, we took the old municipal fish passage culvert program from DEP into transportation. We have tried to streamline the application. I would love my municipal friends to give us some advice if they don't think it is streamlined. We want to try to make this as easy as possible. We ask very little of the towns. We're not reviewing them. The only thing that we ask them to do is if it's going to be over 20 feet, talk to the DOT bridge program so that the town knows upfront whether or not we are willing to take that bridge into our inventory, because design, if it's an unsafe bridge, we don't want it. And we're trying to help advise towns to not get themselves in that situation where they're building something that we don't think is safe. And so really the only other requirement is we ask them to hire a professional engineer who can stamp a plan and then go out when the culvert's in and say that it went in at the elevation it was supposed to be at in the location it was supposed to be. So we're trying to keep it very basic, not add a lot of cost to this. An engineered culvert for a town should not be very expensive, so I don't think that's really adding much cost. And we're not reviewing the designs. So this is another project that we awarded $4 million. It's for phase 1 of a relocation of a wastewater treatment plant in Wiscasset. And so many of these projects that we've worked with them. This is like our 4th time we've done an adaptation fund round of funding. And many of these projects are just so expensive, and we had a $4 million cap. So what we're finding is some of the wastewater districts, water districts, stormwater projects, people are learning how to phase them so that they are eligible for some of these funds and that they can start to pick away at what they have to do. But this is a great example of this is really susceptible to high water, and there's huge risk here of sludge and wastewater being washed into the river. And then I think it's how many people? 810 customers rely on this system. So this is very typical of the type of project that got funded where you have lots of people who are impacted. So another example, if you can look at this guardrail, see how it's leaning, not supposed to do that. This is all eroding back here. The water line is over in here, and it's along the Kennebec River. And so again, you've got 386 customers that rely on that water line, and they're going to lose it. And so good news for them, this project came in under bid, which so rarely happens these days. And so we've agreed to let them keep the total amount and just extend the water line further out. And so I'm excited about that for them. But again, I think these are really good projects. I'm really excited about what we funded. The unmet need, we had 152 applications. I think there would have been even more, except that we did have some caps that I think discourage some towns because it's pretty hard to build a culvert lately for 200,000. We only had 25 million in projects. And there's just, again, Linda, I'm looking at you. I know you know how many culverts every town has. So that was one thing. So lessons learned and next steps. I don't think the capped amount for the stream crossings is enough. We asked for a very small share on the stream crossings. They only had to come up with a local share of $5,000, but they had to pay the extra. We did ask for local shares here. They weren't much. It was like 5% of the project cost. We wanted, Commissioner Van Note's fond of saying he wants people in a town to raise their hands and vote on something so that they can't say, hey, whose idea was it to do that dumb project? That he wants a select board to vote for something, but we didn't want to make it a deal breaker for local match. So we tried to keep the match pretty small. And I think that is important for these programs, especially for smaller towns. Again, one of the other things we had people trying to put things in that were not permittable. So I think there is confusion about what you can get a permit for. So I think that's some conversation we've had with DEP. I think we have another round with some money that GoPIF got for $21 million through a NOAA grant. And I think we've been thinking that we need to do a little proactive education about you need to go talk to DEP and Army Corps early. If you're going to apply for something, show some kind of proof that you've talked to them and that you know that you stand a chance to get a permit. So we tried to pick the projects that were most likely to start construction as soon as possible, but we did fund some design stuff. I do think GoPIF, what I've seen, this is again our fourth round with Brian's community resilience program. I think they are ginning up a whole bunch of people to start to be ready for construction funds, which is a great thing. So I think we're going to just keep seeing more need. We need to streamline the application. I am very big on not making people fill out 10 pages of information for like a simple 6-foot culvert. So I think we need to keep working on that. To date, we have 22 of signatures we still need. We have had to chase communities. I think they're trying to get all their ducks in a row with their engineers, with their contractors. But as was said, government doesn't turn money over overnight. So if you call us on a Monday and want you check on a Friday, that's sometimes kind of tough. So, but I have a staff person who is dogging people, sending them emails. Yes, Linda knows. Sierra is very nice person, but she is determined to get those signatures and to get people to send in their stuff. So we were thrilled to have a part in this, and we are very excited about it. So happy to talk more about it.
Great. Thank you, Joyce. I'm getting a lot of good news here. So, but keep thinking about your questions for, we have one more person to go. Last but not least, Brian is going to talk a little bit about the supplemental budget for the CRPs that GoPIF had. Brian.
Thanks, Linda. And Joyce set this up really nicely. Thanks, Joyce. So in addition to the $60 million that was just discussed, there was another $5 million through the supplemental budget allocated to the Community Resilience Partnership. And this was more on the proactive side to help communities with the planning work for resiliency. And we deployed a portion of that through the first round of community, or the round of community action grants earlier this year. We have 2 additional rounds, one that actually just closed earlier this week, and one that will be opening in the springtime of next year that will deploy the rest of the money. So in the round that happened earlier this year, we made 26 awards from that allocation to 26 communities, totaling about $1.25 million. Those are for grants for up to $50,000. So we're not talking construction type funding here, but more on the planning side. And of those 26 awards, 18 of them were for either community vulnerability assessments, resiliency planning, or incorporating resilience components into comprehensive planning, or project engineering and design. And as Joyce said, and this is kind of sort of jumping ahead to my sort of where the unmet need is, the pipeline is growing here for projects that are getting towards being construction ready. And it's great that we've got another 21 million that Joyce is going to be deploying from the large NOAA grant for construction projects. And as everybody here knows, we need a way to make that Maine Infrastructure Adaptation Fund permanent so that communities have a clear pipeline from the planning to the construction. And the Community Resilience Partnership staff and the DOT staff have been really coordinating closely on making sure that it's clear where communities can go for funding for the planning, the design, engineering work, and where they go for the construction work. Our staff actually sit on each other's review committees, so there's a lot of familiarity with the projects that are getting developed through the pipeline and moving towards implementation. So lots of great work happening there, and I think we need to continue that. And I think it's good for the state to be thinking about how we make these long-term implementation funds sustainable. Just a couple more statistics there. 52% of that funding that went out in the last round went to high social vulnerability communities. So communities that either have, low on the income scale or have some other factors that make them more at risk or have a harder time recovering from events like we saw last year. So we're really pleased that those communities are able to apply for these funds, are finding the process accessible, and we're able to leverage those funds and develop this work. So I'll stop there, Linda, because I know we want to get to some discussion, but this has been a great process, and we're looking forward to the next 2 rounds of grants to be able to get the rest of this money moving.
Great, thanks, Brian. I'm hearing a lot of good lessons learned, a lot of success stories, and still a lot of unmet need. So commission members, what are we learning from this? And this can include those of you who just presented. Feel free to chime in. And other federal recovery funds too. I know that Anne and Mima and different agencies who are sitting at the table today have been overseeing other federal recovery funds. What are we learning? So Judy, go ahead.
Thank you, Linda. So I heard what I thought was an awesome idea from Dan about tax credit for resilience. And then when I heard the need from Commissioner Kelleher about businesses having difficulty coming up with match, I just put those two together really quickly as a way of a tax credit increase for resilience, and that could go toward recognizing that as match. So I thought those two went together really nicely, and I'd like to know what others think about that, going forward. And then another couple of things I put forward, or I put together, is, Joyce, you mentioned really great success carving some money out for culverts. And one of the things that I've heard when the money shifted from DEP over to transportation is that the criteria for fish passage and habitat improvement was lost in the stream crossing criteria. And I'm just thinking that I don't want to make it a tougher application, but whether you heard that and whether there's an opportunity for at least some enhancement points to communities who are serving both goals, because they are very complementary goals with fish passage and resilience. And when Brian indicated that the CRP grants are, really contributing to design, and I don't know whether they specify in that design whether or not they also do the background research to say whether habitat enhancement is part of their design. That seems to be the place where communities could dovetail between these two programs without it taking a lot more time for them to apply to Joyce's program, if that all makes sense. So I'll stop and let's see what reactions are.
I'd like to respond. So Judy, Maine DOT has had 2 rounds of culvert funding. The first was a fish-oriented program, and in fact, Maine Audubon and TNC were scores in the program, and fish passage, fish enhancement was the critical piece of the scoring. IF&W and DMR were part of the team. We just facilitated the projects. The second fund was with these funds, and it was very clear in the law that was written that was not one of the factors we were to use. And so I think there's a lot of misinformation and frankly some chatter that's not right going around right now. We didn't get more municipal funds for the fish passage program last year. The funds were for the adaptation. And if you read the law, it was pretty clear. Now, did I have my biologist, Mr. Eric Ham, who you know, scoring? And do I think that 90% of those culverts we funded were great fish passage projects? Yes, I do.
Cool.
So I
Okay.
think, yeah, so I think somehow we've got to, I'm gonna like write a letter to the editor or something, because this keeps coming back.
You know, you're right. Now that I recall, it was the way the legislation was written. It wasn't that you took it out. So I apologize for that.
No, that's good. Thank you.
Misspeaking, but thank you.
Yeah, thanks for those questions and comments and corrections, Joyce. Charlie.
So, I think the presentation on where the money went is really interesting, but I think a more interesting presentation would be, what is the money being used for? And I come back to something that Jake said in his presentation in terms of businesses. Well, what are you going to do for resilience? We'll try harder. Try what? I think that we have now accumulated, as a result of last year, from both state and federal sources, the beginnings of a really rich set of data about what people are doing, and when particularly small communities, but other communities look around and say, well, what should we do about what are our options for resilience? I mean, some things are obvious. Replace a culvert washes out, you replace the culvert. But how big a culvert do you replace it with? Do you do anything else to the road at the same time? And so I think we need to look for ways in which the body of experience that we are gaining and have gained with all of the money that's been spent can be examined and turned into useful lessons that are accessible to everyone around the state in a fairly simplified but convenient and useful format. But I think that's a task for us to think about. It's one thing to know that all this money goes out there, and that was helpful. And the question of what money can we get from the feds is helpful. But I think what the stories that I heard pointed to is people need to figure out what they're going to do first, and then they can look for money. And they tend to say, well, how much is this going to cost, without saying, well, what are we going to actually do? And they really need to ask that question first. And we need to help people, particularly under-resourced people and groups and communities, be able to do that. So that's one lesson I took from all the presentations. I want to just say one other thing with respect to Sam's presentations on federal funding. I mean, it's clear as a result of the last 24 hours that nobody knows anything about what the feds are going to do in the future. We are entering a phase in which federal policy, in which chaos will be a kind definition or description of federal policy. We're going to have to rely more and more on our own resources and our own capacity to do with a lot of things, and that includes money. And I don't know how we're going to get it, because I don't think people are still, as I've said before, people do not understand how profoundly climate change, if I can use those words in this friendly crowd without daring to get us all into trouble, how much it has shifted what needs to be done and how much we need to be paying for things. I'm not sure we're there yet, but under any circumstances, at least the next 4 years, and probably longer than that, we're going to have to really figure out ways to rely on our own resources, because the federal government is not going to be a reliable partner.
Thank you, Charlie, for those sobering and I'm afraid all too true words there at the end. I agree about figuring out how we can share the stories of what actually has been done. So for example, in Stonington, I know what the Working Waterfront funds have accomplished and what they've done, but I don't know anything at all about how they were used in other places. You know, are we raising wharves? Are we rebuilding wharves? Are we making them more resilient? And what kind of construction techniques are we using? And are we coming in on budget or under budget? And, you know, there's a whole, you know, a raft of questions around this funding that I think we could really benefit from as we move it forward. And I did really hear, especially from Joyce, about, you know, the idea that we're learning that we need to simplify things, especially for our small towns. And we need to lower the matches, especially for our small towns. Again, speaking from Stonington, I know that there were several of the Working Waterfront grants that were applied for that were not at the full value of the repairs that needed to be done because the businesses did not feel like they could match up to 50% of that. So they actually applied for what they could match, which was significantly less than the actual cost of the damage. So, you know, we just have to consider these questions and hopefully get some kind of scalable or tiered system in place pretty quickly if that's how we want to go. So that, you know, so that we can really deal with this question of how much each municipality, how much skin in the game each one has to have based upon its size and its capacity. Do we have other comments about any other federal recovery funds that have been used in the state that we've learned about since these storms? We've had a year now to learn. Anne, did you want to add anything? Anybody else?
Sure, certainly. I'll take the opportunity. And I won't reiterate anything that was said earlier in the presentation, but you notice the numbers seemed kind of low on the public assistance side, and it's a systemic issue under the FEMA public assistance programs that it takes a long time. It's a long process for funds to actually make their way back successfully to municipalities. So we're just now starting to cut checks for the December and the January storms, respectively. So just kind of let that resonate, if you will, that, you know, the state's power to make the 60 million move like so much quicker was so much more effective than these federal programs, which continue to be really nuanced and impactful, but really stressful and burdensome for communities. But those numbers will change. They're going to start to go up very rapidly. But one thing I did want to share with the group is FEMA has an interim policy out right now. It's called the Public Assistance Mitigation Cost Share Incentives Policy. And this is something where municipalities now effectively have the ability to, well, once this goes into effect, excuse me, get up to 5% more federal cost share or 10% more federal cost share. So that could effectively mean if all qualifications associated with this incentives policy were met by a municipality, FEMA would come forward under Public Assistance Recovery Program, put forward up to 85% federal cost share. The state's already confirmed we'd stick with the 15% cost share. That would put a 0% cost share on the local level. The tough pickle on that is to get the extra 5%. That'll be easy enough, hopefully, for our municipalities because you just need to prove effective mitigation measures. But to get that 10%, you have to have adopted 2021 building codes, and we're still in 2015. So with that being said, FEMA is working more initiatives to incorporate mitigation in disaster recovery alongside major congressional dumps on the mitigation pre-disaster side of the house for competitive grant programs for people to take advantage of. So as these policies go into effect, I'll certainly circulate information about them. And I'll put a link to that interim policy in the chat so everyone can take a look at that as well.
Thanks, Anne. I'm going to I think we could probably talk more about this, but I'm going to stop us for now. So, because we do really need to get on to our final report, our work plan for that. And we were supposed to have a 15-minute break here. I'm going to give us 5 to have a stretch break again. So everybody please be back at 3:21 and we'll dig into our final work plan. Thank you.
Yeah, I ultimately just want 2 boxes of printer paper.
Just a reminder to everyone to turn your video back on when you're back so we can see if everybody's back. And we should be back. We're going to jump right back in here. Okay, let's get going. I know people will fall in as we go. And Hannah, I got your note that you're going to have to leave, and I just didn't know if you'd like to add any final comments before you have to leave the meeting today.
I will just say that we're heading into the work that our team will support the commission on in the next 6 months. So I'm very sorry to have to miss that. I have to go meet with the governor on another topic, but I just would say I think we're excited to think about how do we use the individual talents of our commission members and kind of engage in a way to go a little deeper in the next few months with some smaller groups. And we also are really looking forward to kind of big picture comments about what this plan that we promised by May looks like. So again, I'll watch the recording and hear from Brian. So sorry to abandon ship, but thank you again, Linda, Dan, and Sam, and Brian and team.
Thanks so much, Hannah. And before we begin this next part, I know both Dan and I want to thank you all again for the incredible work done on the interim report. So in our first 6 months, as Hannah just said, a final report needs to go deeper. So we're going to need to dig deeper and really get into some implementation details and probably do some research, even more than we have done, and get beyond the things that we can bring to the table quickly, as we did in the first 6 months, our kind of existing knowledge, and get down to what can we do that's new? What can we do that's going to improve things? What can we do that's really going to make a difference? And that is outside of business as usual for us, right? So our final report in May is going to be about deepening those interim recommendations and hopefully adding significant new analysis. I want to thank Sam for what he's already added today. You'll see from our work plan that we'll have another meeting with him in January to get new analysis on the data that they've been gathering for us. The most importantly, we really need to get detailed action-oriented guidance. So we've had our 12 big recommendations, and now we have to really get action-oriented and detailed. So the final deliverable that the governor is looking forward to seeing, it's going to accomplish at least 3 things. So updating our interim recommendations with more detailed guidance on funding considerations, outcomes, partnerships, timelines, and accountability. So specifics in those areas. Where implementation has already begun, we can state the progress that has been made, somewhat as we just did with the report on the recovery funding. Number 2, identify specific areas that need really urgent attention. This will include high-risk geographic areas that are informed by our consultants' risk mapping analysis and high-priority infrastructure categories with strategies for mitigation and adaptation. And number 3, a list of concrete actions the state and others should take over specific timelines. For example, in the next 1 to 2 years, the next 3 to 5 years, the next 6 to 10 years. This work will include identifying specific state-led infrastructure improvement and hazard mitigation projects or initiatives, developing criteria for the state's prioritization of infrastructure improvements and capital improvement planning, and prioritizing 2 to 5 federal funding opportunities and other financial options that align with these projects or support a capital improvement plan. So essentially, we know that we have been, prior to these storms and prior to the huge impact of climate change a year ago, I think all of your agencies and us as a state have felt undercapitalized for infrastructure to begin with, right? So our baseline, where we're starting from, our starting line, is already undercapitalized. So now we're talking about a capital improvement plan. How are we going to work with that? So the proposed work plan for the next 5 months is centered around breaking us into some smaller groups so that we can really dig into these specific topics. So these small groups are going to be supported by GOPIF staff, and they're going to report back to the commission with suggestions for consideration. So in working with Hannah's staff and with all the GoPIF team, we've proposing the following 4 small groups, and we look forward to your thoughts about this. The 4 groups so far that we are thinking about include 1 on vulnerable infrastructure prioritization. Basically, what I was just talking about is where are the critical infrastructure improvements that need to be addressed. 2, energy resilience. We know this from the survey that we did, that was really one of the #1 things that people mention the most when asked about how the storms have impacted them. It's about their energy, right? It's about, do they have power? Number 3, project implementation challenges. So these include things like capacity and funding. But 4, a real focus on long-term funding and financing strategy. So I heard one of you, maybe Judy, say that earlier, that we need a focus on that, and we agree that one of the groups needs to be completely focused on just the long-term funding and financing. So today, what we're asking you guys to do is to join at least one of these small groups. The groups are going to meet 2 to 3 times between January and March. And what we're doing, in fact, and I'll show you the work plan here in a minute, we'll have a calendar of the meeting dates, is not having a full commission meeting. This is what we're proposing, skipping the full commission meeting in February in order to really allow you all time to work with your small groups, knowing that we're asking a lot, okay? That it's a lot of time to do the small group work. And if we can ease that by not having one of our 3-hour commission meetings in February, that might really assist the small groups in achieving what needs to be achieved. So Brian, do you have the calendar on a slide? I think you do. Yeah, there we go. So this is what, with that in mind, this is what we're proposing for our work plan meeting schedule. We've talked about state and federal funding today. January 22nd would also be via Zoom, and talk about the risk data that Sam and his team have collected and are collecting. February, no meeting because the small groups will be meeting. March 19th via Zoom, small groups report back. It could possibly be a longer meeting than our typical 3-hour meeting in order to really gather in that important input. And then in April 10th and in May, hopefully we'll see if the weather has cleared or has never happened. We could do 2 in-person meetings. In April, reviewing a draft final report and discussing that. And in May 7th, releasing the final report. So the same thing that we just went through for the last 6 months as we developed our interim report. This is a really urgent timeline and a compressed timeline. We basically have 5 months to get some real specifics down that will be actionable and doable. So we really do need all of your participation to meet that high bar set for us by the executive order. So I'd like to open it up for discussion now. We can take the slide down and hear some feedback on the overall plan, the idea of the small groups, your ability to participate, and what you think of the priorities in terms of those small groups and those topics. Charlie.
I think the groups make sense. I would like to see, I don't have the list in front of me, but I would like to see, I think it's number 1 or 2
You want to put that
undertakes.
back up, Brian? Go ahead. Brian's going to put it back up, Charlie. Yep. Just go ahead, Charlie.
Yeah, I would like to see 1 or 3 take up the suggestion I made earlier about looking at what's being done and finding a way to catalog the experience we're having.
Yeah.
And as for myself, I can work on 1, 3, and 4. I wanted to mention just one other thing that's not that's a sideline to this, but one of my other projects is serving as part of the staff of the Blue Economy Task Force that the legislature set up. And we are, I'm going to be spending the Christmas writing the report on that task force. And one of the things that is going to be in it, because I'm going to write this part, is that is the entire resilience effort is part of the blue economy, and is an extremely important economic opportunity as well as an economic challenge. So I want to get on the agenda of those who are talking about the blue economy, the whole resilience area in the coast, and so that they see both they understand the challenge. We want to get them to see the economic opportunities, particularly in the rebuilding of the coast and the opportunities for significant innovation in that area. So I just want to let you know that that will be coming out in January, and that's how I'm going to try and tie these two strings of my scattered existence together.
Thanks, Charlie. Yeah, I appreciate that. I think that it is one of the issues with rebuilding for resilience is that we have to be looking at the future opportunities. The other things that are changing with climate, the water temperature, et cetera, that are affecting species migrations and different things are really going to affect how our working waterfronts operate, and to give us some innovation there, as well as which is economic resilience, right? In addition to physical resilience, is going to be super important. Thank you for that. Dan, you just turned your camera off. I was just going to call on you.
Yeah, no, thanks. This generally looks good to me. On 2, I think it might be similar to that, worth kind of a 2, sub A before we get to A, which is, I think, maybe for whoever kind of wants to participate, a more fulsome discussion about current activities happening. Both of our investor-owned utilities are in the process of updating both their long-term grid planning, but also particularly relevant to this group, their climate change protection plans. They're both of them, to my knowledge, are having public meetings to update the plan that was done before, where they're doing a lot of work around these these topics and around resiliency in general. And I think it would be helpful to kind of get that understanding, where I definitely agree that there's need for additional community technical assistance. It would also be helpful to understand kind of what's happening in the space and kind of how is it being planned for to inform both A and B.
Yeah, great point, Dan. Thanks for that. I know I've participated in one of Versant's first presentations on their grid planning, so you are correct. They are in the middle of that, and we need to know what they're undertaking already before we can begin to make any recommendations. Dan Tishman.
Yeah, Linda, one of the things that occurs to me that we might want to do in sort of the same manner that we started, and that's in collaboration, is it occurs to me that we could, for each one of these subcommittees, especially if we're going to have more than one meeting, which we are, that we might look around the state for other folks or experts who we think are already working in the space, to both interact with them, not for information gathering, but for brainstorming about potential solutions. Just for example, the 2 organizations that I think about on the coast, and there are many more that have been thinking about resiliency for a long time, are the Island Institute and the Gulf of Maine Research Institute. And I think in bringing them to the table, as a participant in some of the dialogue, I think would be helpful for us, but also kind of one of the things I worry about is that, and I've said this before, that there are a lot of people working on a lot of these issues, and we should tap into that. But we also, I think, at the state level have a responsibility to sort of help focus it, so we don't end up with another plan, and then all of a sudden next year have, one of those organizations, release their plan. So I think that is perhaps part of our approach. I also would really encourage all of us commission members to really think out of the box and not limit ourselves by saying, oh, that will never happen. It's kind of like what Sam said, we all want to start by thinking we're gonna park in space number one. We may not be able to, we may not get there, but we should not be afraid to think about things like words that don't resonate well, taxes or land use, or kind of figuring a way to accelerate certain things. I was not aware, but I think it was Joyce that said, we will not qualify for certain federal funds because we're not working in the most recent building codes. Well, maybe we should be finding a way to accelerate the building codes so we could be, eligible. And if, having never revised building codes in this, I'm using this just as an example in the state of Maine, but been very involved in the state of New York, in the normal system, that takes years. But if there's a will to accelerate and there are goals and there is a leader, in this case, perhaps the governor, who is willing to say, I'm going to lay this down and, I want this done in 3 months or 6 months, stranger things have happened. So, I really think we should not enter these with any kind of limitation. There are not going to be any bad ideas. We should be really creative.
Yeah, thanks, Dan. I completely agree with you as your co-chair. I think that we need to be innovative and aggressive. That's our purview, and that's an opportunity and a privilege, honestly, because we're not working within any one, particular state agency. We're working to make recommendations from outside. So I think that's super important. And I see that Pat's got his hand up next, so he may have something to say about those working waterfront groups and all those initiatives that are happening. I don't know. Pat.
Yeah, actually, that's exactly where I was going to start, Linda. I think what Hannah and I have talked about is bringing in those outside groups that are working on it, the Island Institutes, the GMRIs, the Maine Coast Fishermen's Association, to make sure we're not overlapping and duplicating work. So I think that'll be really critical. And I think the things that we need to be thinking about here and probably in all areas is how we can make sure that people are working on areas of priority, and again, not duplicating work. The other thing I was just going to bring up, I'm looking at the small groups. I certainly don't have any issues the way it's laid out. The number one, vulnerable infrastructure prioritization, right? Transportation, water, working waterfront, et cetera. Very different groups, very different issues, very different funding streams potentially there. And maybe that's all right, but there maybe need to be some focus within area number one. And that maybe that's what kind of either that or maybe number 4 kind of works the kinks out of that as we start prioritizing things. But I certainly think number 4 and specifically, we need to think about what are those long-term funding and have a very clear federal funding strategy around this. I was just going back and forth with Hannah on text. Maine Department of Marine Resources utilizes a lobbyist in Washington, right? I'm the only person in the only agency in state government that does that. We should be thinking about that and how we can utilize some outside expertise to be helping us with those issues in Washington, because as you all know, it's going to be it's going to be a winding, twisting road here in the next 4 years, and having some expertise down there to help work on these type of issues, I think is going to be critical. We can't just depend on the Maine delegation, and that's clear. When I worked on the issues around right whales, I needed a very diverse set of senators all across the country, and that's why we utilized outside assistance in Washington as a lobbyist to get that done. And I can see the same thing needed here as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Pat. Thanks for those comments. And yeah, I mean, we could maybe use as a resilience measure how many working waterfront meetings we all each need to sit in every week, right? Across all the different efforts. If we can get those down, we might be able to say there's some coherence to the whole thing. Judy.
Thank you, Linda. I think the groups look great. The only thing that strikes me is it's very project oriented, prioritization and funding. I don't see communication, preparation beforehand, during, and after an event. And that was such a strong issue at the January special meeting of the January meeting of the Climate Council. And I was thinking, well, maybe that's the Climate Council stuff. But then I went and I looked at our interim report, and we did stress those communication networks. And I wonder if that should be, I don't know, 1D, 3C, but something in here that has an observation around that we have. Maybe our vulnerable infrastructure is our communication networks. And I'm curious what Annie thinks of that comment. Thanks.
Yeah, Judy, thanks for making that comment. And we did discuss communications during one of our planning sessions, because it was definitely a hot issue in my own mind. And I can't remember, Brian might be able to help me remember where we landed on that and why we're not necessarily seeing it here clearly. And Annie, before I move on to other speakers, did you want to respond to that at all or add to what Judy had to say?
I'm in full agreement. I'll keep it short. Full agreement. And I'd love the opportunity to bring in the state's interoperability, statewide interoperability communications coordinator, our SWIC, to ensure we have the subject matter expertise to speak on emergency communications with the appropriate verbiage.
Great. And Dan or Brian, do you want to remind me where we ended up in thinking about that communication system in terms of these small groups?
Yeah, so the communications recommendations ended up in that first bucket of the 12, the sort of immediate actions, right? And I think the thought there is that those might be moving ahead towards implementation on a track that would, and these small groups are more thinking about where we need to go deeper for the plan in May. So, but it's a really good flag, Judy. And I think we should think about if that needs to end up in one of these small groups too.
Great. Thanks for adding that, Brian. Deborah.
Thank you, Linda. I think these are interesting groups, and I like the, excuse me, the reference to funding, but I don't get the sense of, again, this urging us to think outside the box and really creatively, even on funding. So we had some good suggestions here about maybe we could create some tax credits or call for some new tax credits. We had some good conversation about philanthropy, catalyzing and bridging some of this. So to me, I mean, it's not that explicit, but it's not urging us to think beyond the existing funding streams, which of course are important. Obviously thinking through how we access existing federal and state and other, public funding streams. But I just want to urge us to think even bigger. And then I guess I wanted to follow on with what Pat said. I would really like to urge us to partner with, where possible, not just check in with other coalitions and such, but is there any way we can complement each other? Is there any way we can support each other in sort of kind of the supporting the existing groups and collaborations that are already doing a lot of the great work, or even existing, significant not-for-profits that are out there doing some of this work. So just want to really like that recommendation for touching base, but maybe even going further in partnering together. So thanks for that.
Yeah, thank you, Deborah. And I think I heard in Pat's saying that it was more than a check-in, that it is about bringing everybody to the table. Because there are some significant efforts underway and there's been a lot of work done. So I think getting everybody at the same table, pulling the same boat along will be important. Noel, are you there? Yep.
Yes, I am. Going back to Dan's point about thinking outside the box and building on Judy's catch, I think there's also general community education/awareness that's missing here. I think, and that's also kind of falling within the thinking outside the box kind of approach, which is there's stuff we can be doing to educate the communities at large. And like Judy pointed out, this seems very project based, seems very like organizational based, and maybe that's where we have the highest impact. I'm not denying that, but I think it would be great for us to also parallelly do some statewide kind of direct action organizing, kind of getting people to kind of really pay attention to this so that individual communities, local, neighborhoods can start doing some of the stuff that can help as well. And I don't know what that would be. I'm not an expert in that area, but I do believe in the power of people making changes in small corners of communities across the state.
Thank you. So I mean, I guess I think what you're saying in part is there an education plan component to this, right? So different from the communications network we're talking about, which is really the emergency communications network and how that string of communications works, but our external communications for how we educate about this work. Is that an accurate summary?
Yes, and to kind of really empower people as well, not just organizations and coalitions, but also like Mainers across the state who can be doing things, you know, and to chip away at this in a very tiny way, but significant way that would add up. It's both, I think. Yeah, but yes, what you said is accurate.
Great, thank you so much. So what we're going to ask you to do next before the end of the meeting is either in the chat or through an email to Brian to put your top 2 choices for small group work. Give us your recommendations. So Brian has said you could put those in the chat or you can send him an email. But we do want to make sure you have a moment here to reflect on this, to think about where your particular skills and expertise might make the biggest impact and where you're going to be the most engaged for the next 3 months in terms of this small group work. So let's just give us a minute there, and then I'll turn it over to Dan to wrap up the meeting. And Brian, you guys are able to capture the chat, yeah?
Yep, we're taking it down and we'll save the chat.
Great, thanks.
Great, Noel, thanks. Feel free to think about this and shoot me an email over the next week or so. That's fine. And I will say, just to Deborah's point, I think these small groups will have a lot of latitude also to sort of refine what their scope is going to be. So, all of the comments we heard today are great. And I think feel free to bring those to the first meeting as you all are developing your sort of scope for your work together and your recommendations.
Yeah, I think that's a good point, Brian. When we created these proposals for these small groups, we made fairly large buckets, as you all have pointed out in your comments. So it will be up to the people that end up in the work groups to really refine what they're headed toward. But again, I'm going to urge you all to think about like where your particular resources are going to be able to make the biggest impact in these conversations, because that's what's going to be super important in order to get this work done effectively and well.
And not to complicate things anymore, but I do think, especially in the Climate Council as well, across working groups, some level of cross-pollination, whether that's through the GoPIF team or folks who want to roam free, but just so we're not working in silos all the time.
I think that's a great idea, Kurt. And I think both Dan and I and the GoPIF team plan to circulate a bit. So thank you for that. And Dan, I think with that, if you haven't made your choices yet, don't feel rushed. But do please get those to Brian about where you want your work to be. So Dan, it's all yours.
Yeah, well, listen, I think this has been a great meeting. We're going to be getting into the weeds, which I think for some of us is the exciting part of what we do. We're problem solvers. Sam Roy, Brody, sorry. I really appreciate your input. It's been very helpful. I think we, ultimately, I think we're going to model something after what Texas has been able to accomplish under your leadership. I'm heartened that, by thinking out of the box, we shouldn't be afraid to go big. And, to some degree, I think the opportunity here is if we can create a final report that's both meaningful, benefits the people of the state of Maine, and charts a course for the future that we are going to be able to, it's going to be a forever plan, because I don't think we're going to see any of the challenges go away anytime soon. And hopefully we'll end up with something that keeps, everybody's feet to the fire to always think about this as they move forward with projects, and both at the private and the state level. So I mean, I'm really happy with the direction we're heading in. We're probably going to ask each, as Linda has said, we're going to probably ask each one of you to spend more time in the next 6 months than we have in the past 6 months. I'd encourage everybody to really think about their 2025 first 2 quarter schedules and allow some time to really focus on this stuff. We are committed. Linda and I are committed to delivering the final report in May, not slipping. And I will just say that, a few weeks ago when Linda and I delivered the report, the interim report to the governor, she was incredibly enthusiastic, and even acknowledging that she believes that this is going to be a bit of a tough legislative budget season. That being said, one of the things that she was the most committed about doing was making sure that we could maintain momentum in setting this commission and the Climate Council work up for success. So we just have to give her the tools to do that. The next meeting is January 22nd. I will, unless there's anybody that has anything else to say, we can yield 6 minutes back to everybody. I will, offer everybody a wonderful holiday season. We'll knock on wood that high tides and strong winds don't happen together. Although we did have 65-mile-an-hour winds on our place a week ago, which raised some havoc, but not the kind of damage of last year. So happy holidays, everybody. Thanks for your participation, and see you in a month or so.
Happy holidays. See you in the new year, everybody. Thank you so much.
Thanks. And by the way, just thanks to Brian and to the whole team again. You guys are terrific, and we can give you a day or two off during the holidays.
We'll take it. Thanks, Dan.
Thanks a lot. Take care.
Thanks, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.